Welcome and thank you for joining us at the COVID-19 Impact on Employment and Redundancies webinar today. I'm your host, Amy. Today we'll discover the impact of the pandemic on employment as Protect CEO Michael Connolly discusses the recent trends in employment levels in the electrical industry in Victoria and the role Protect plays to assist employers once they decide redundancies or stand downs are necessary. Our presenters, Michael Connolly has worked with industry funds since 2003. He has held the finance and investment roles before being appointed Protect CEO in 2017. Also joining Michael to answer questions from our NECA members will be Workplace Relations Advisor Natalie Mill and Saras Farah. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to go through some housekeeping with you. You'll be put on mute during the presentation to reduce any background noises and disruptions. Should you wish to ask a question, please type the question in the chat box or raise your hand after the presentation. Without any further ado, I'll now hand over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Amy, and Saras and Natalie, you can turn your cameras off. Thank you. Yes, thanks for having me. Thanks for joining us for this presentation. I was actually invited to present on the 19th of June, and you can imagine the number of changes in direction that we've had in that time, in just over 2 months, but hopefully we've got it to a point now where it's going to be very relevant for the people in the Victorian electrical industry today. So just by way of introduction, Protect is a worker entitlement fund, and we were established in the year 2000, so 20th year this year. We're a redundancy fund, that's our core business for the electrical industry and manufacturing. We are national, but predominantly with our origins in Victoria. We also do income protection insurance for the electrical industry, among other industries. And the other thing that's quite important at the moment is another service that we provide is counselling. So I'll touch on that later in the presentation. So I might just disappear. And there's a picture of myself, and I think Amy's adequately introduced me already, so I'll move on. Just a quick overview of what we'll talk about today. So firstly, our members, I'll give you an introduction to who our members are, and I guess you can see where you fit in to the presentation. Then I'll just set the scene looking at employment nationally, but then really focus on employment in the electrical industry in Victoria. So hopefully that's our audience that we're talking to today. Spend a bit of time sort of making sense of that data and also looking at what else might be going on that's not showing up in our data as well. And then I'd just like to finish off by helping people understand how Protect can help you get through a redundancy decision and what we can do to help afterwards and during that process. So let's have a look at our member profile as the first aspect. Now, in order to join Protect as the redundancy fund for the industry, that comes about via an industrial agreement, an EBA. So that may lead some people to think that we only deal with the largest businesses in the industry. And I think you can see from the figures there that that's not quite the case. So we've got a much broader spread than what you might understand. So these figures, if we look at the chart on the top right, that shows that 54%, so over half of the employers that we deal with are small businesses, and they've got 1 to 5 employees is sort of the definition of that. Similarly, the large employers by number only account for 7% of the number of employers that we deal with. So by and large, of the 550 employers, there's a good spread, but a lot of them are small and medium players, which is also a reasonable overlap with NECA's membership as well, as I understand it. If we look at the workforce in the bottom chart, so we've got about 8,000 workers in Victoria in the electrical industry that are currently employed. And you see the reverse, as you might expect. So 51% of the workers are employed by that 7% of large employers. So hopefully if you're sitting there thinking, just trying to place yourself in those pie charts, hopefully you can see where you fit in. But basically the point is that we do cover a broad section of the industry, 550 employers and 8,000 workers. Now let's have a look at what's happening in employment nationally. I won't dwell on this, but these are things that are in the public domain. So the chart in the centre showing employed people in Australia, and guess what I've referred to there as the COVID cliff. So employment has dropped away extremely significantly, very noticeable. So employment across the country in all sectors, probably looking round about where it was in 2016, 2017. So not been a good outcome, as we know. 250,000 Victorian jobs are lost, and that was before the announcement of stage 4. So the predictions are that that'll almost double as well, unfortunately. Bottom left of screen there, another measure that the Bureau of Statistics puts out is payroll jobs nationally. So 6.4% down since March, so the March to June figures. Where we've seen the big hit, as you're probably aware, accommodation, food service, restaurants, arts and entertainment, those sorts of sectors. So they're really prompting the COVID cliff, as I've called it. But what we're interested in is construction, and more specifically electrical. So construction has done better than other areas nationally, but Victoria has done slightly worse, and I guess we'll drill into that in a moment. On the right of screen there, we've got building approvals, so it's always a good lead indicator of what's going on in the sector. Year on year, 16% down, 7% down in value of work, but that's March to March. So once we get the June figures, once they're available, I expect that's going to be a lot closer to the 16% in the line above it. But also residential is significantly down on the other forms of building. So I guess to summarise, construction's been doing better than most, but Victorian construction is doing slightly worse than national, and residential is also doing worse than other buildings. So that's just a bit of scene setting. But let's now sort of switch into the data that we've got to protect and seeing how we can use that to get an understanding of what's actually happening in the electrical industry in Victoria and how that compares to the national results that are being reported in the papers and the like. So here's the data that we have, which will be the 550 employers and roughly the 8,000 workers. So this chart is showing the number of workers who are actively employed in the electrical industry in Victoria, based on the information that we receive from employers each month through their contributions. So we've peaked in February in terms of employment in the industry, but very clearly we've started to reduce. Thankfully at this point, and this is to the end of July, 31st of July, it's not what you'd describe as a cliff. We haven't seen a COVID cliff yet that we've seen in other sectors, thankfully. So in terms of the actual numbers, it's 4.8% down from the February peak. So that's a noticeable decline, but certainly not a cliff by any means. Employment in the industry is actually up marginally, up 1.4% from June last year. Now, just notice on the bottom left of that chart, we've got the just the scale on the axis, starting that at 6,600. Now, if we change that scale and look at that same data with a scale of 0, the whole graph looks a lot flatter. So probably one of those things that in 3 to 5 years' time, if you were to look at this chart and try to work out what the impact of COVID was, looking at that chart as it is now, it'd be hard to pick up what the impact it is. Now, yet. I think pretty much everything I'm saying at the end of July, and even as we stand now, the 12th of August, I think it looks as though things are starting to turn, and I'll give you some indication shortly on that. So I expect the graph for once we add August to that, we'll see a stepped drop, but probably not a cliff, is what we're seeing at the moment. Okay, let's just drill in a little bit further into some of the data that we've got, and looking between February and July, so from the peak to the current point. What we've seen is that small employers are employing 5% less people, so a fairly small drop so far. Medium employers have only reduced their workforce by 1%, so that's a very noticeable and surprising result in the current circumstance. So I think that's telling us that those medium employers, which we're defining as 6 to 50 in their workforce, they're holding on to their staff, which is a good thing. But so far, we'll wait and see what happens over the next month. Large employers is where we've seen the most movement. So perhaps, yes, a large number of workers are being, I guess, moved on from perhaps some of those larger projects, and that's a lot more noticeable in our figures. So another area to drill down on, looking at comparing the employers and how many they were employing in February compared to July. So 27% of the employers, just over a quarter, are employing less workers in July than they were in February. So really no surprise there. The next two, I was a little bit surprised by, that 18% of employers have actually put people on, and 55% are unchanged. So they were employing 20 people in February, and they're still employing 20 people in July. So again, that will be something, if we can rerun these numbers through August and the end of August, it'll be interesting to see whether those two shift. Now, of course, because we know employment is dropping, the 27% of employers who are employing less, so they've employed about 900 less, and the ones that are putting them on have only put on about 300, so there's quite a bit of leakage there. On to severance payments. So these are the payments that Protect makes to workers once their position's been made redundant. And I guess this is one of the charts that significantly has changed in terms of the story over the last few weeks. And in fact, I was still changing this description of it as recently as yesterday. So what we saw in terms of the number of claim payments that we've made through this period, it's been fairly stagnant and fairly consistent between April and mid-July. Slightly higher than what we were seeing before the first lockdown, but no higher than a random week that we saw in February. Okay, so then in the last month, we've seen quite a pickup. And if you probably ignore the annual statement, so it's actually twice yearly that we send out statements to our workers, that usually prompts quite a few redundancy claims as it triggers people's memories to put a claim in. What we're seeing now, stage 4 on the right of screen there, so they're picking up, hasn't yet exceeded what we saw in the first lockdown, and really only just marginally higher than that random week in February. So it's not skyrocketing by any means, thankfully, because that means people have still been in work to this point. Now, hardship claims is an interesting one. That's something that we've introduced as part of the managing the pandemic. So to qualify for this, a worker needs to be stood down with pay. So they're still employed, they're not redundant, they're in employment, but they're not earning an income because it's a stand down without pay. And they'll get 2 lots of $2,000 from us 5 weeks apart. Now, we've only received 21 payments or requests for payment in the March to July period. So that was really surprisingly low, but a good thing because it meant people were not being stood down. But what we saw on Monday of this week, we saw 31 of those claim requests come in. So we've seen quite an uptick, not quite so substantial yesterday, around about 16, I think it was. So they're certainly picking up, which means more people are being stood down without pay, but at least they've got an option to get something from us in that circumstance. That's probably the key number that we're watching to get an understanding for what's going on in the industry. So I think we're expecting another busy week in terms of claims. We'll get a similar week to last week. So where it's showing stage 4, I think last week will be very similar to this week, but certainly picking up and at reasonably high levels. I thought it was also sharing with you I guess the mood of the industry when people are contacting us. So this is a combination of phone calls and emails, and you can see when we had the first lockdown at the end of March that we got quite a spike. Interestingly, the spike wasn't as high as what we get, again, the annual statements or the biannual statements. Not a great deal different to that peak, which is, regardless of COVID, that's usually our busiest week or two of the year. So we didn't really exceed that. The interesting thing to note, though, was just how quickly that dropped off and reduced through to the end. So I guess this can be an indicator of people's anxieties. The more nervous they get about the situation, the more inclined they are to phone us up and get those anxieties eased. So the reasons for the drop off, I think, obviously the industry remaining open, and that was becoming quite clear in at the end of March and into early April. And then, of course, we're seeing the reverse at the other end of this chart, where the industry has got a lot of restrictions on it, and therefore the anxiety is rising at the right there. JobKeeper helped an enormous amount, but also the communications. NECA's put out a lot of terrific material and guides for employers, and we've referred our members to those as well. The ETU put out a range of communications. We're all talking to each other, so all the communications were fairly consistent going out there, which was good and avoided some confusion and some anxiety. Probably the more interesting chart was what happens with our website traffic. And again, it does indicate, what the level of anxiety is for people. And at the end of March, it was fairly unprecedented, is the common word in the climate at the moment. Meanwhile, what we've seen with stage 4, nowhere near the peaks that we saw. So what we're expecting is going on is that people have got their information that they need. They've got it through March, and they've contacted us and checked the website all through this period. So while we've got some anxiety within the industry, sort of on the right of screen as a result of stage 4, hopefully most people have got the information that they need through this period, through those already looking on the website, the fact that we've released our statements to workers and employers, so that they should be fairly well informed about what happens in the event of a redundancy or a stand down. So that's the extent of the data. Now let's just try to make a bit of sense of it. And also, if you're sitting there asking yourself, well, that doesn't quite apply to us, or what if this, what if that? I just thought of a few points that are worth mentioning to you, that just to clarify the data. So these are things that are not showing up but might also be going in the industry that we've got no visibility over. So if people are on, if your employees are on reduced hours, or if they're on leave, that's not going to show up. So they'll still show up in our data as being employed. If they're being redeployed, if they're doing a different job than they were in February, again, that's not going to show up. Our scheme doesn't cover apprentices, so it's quite possible that apprentices are being let go first, and if so, that we wouldn't have any visibility over that in our numbers. Redundancies of office workers, people in management, those in IR, HR, finance, people who are off the tools, typically not on an EBA, so therefore they're not covered by our scheme. So those sort of things could be going on in the industry, but we're predominantly dealing with the electricians who are on the tools. We don't have a great deal of visibility over the domestic sector or sole traders. And also if there's issues with productivity. So one of the examples, of course, is if there are lift restrictions and there's only smaller numbers of people being able to get up in a high-rise apartment, slowing the projects down and projects taking longer. Again, that's not going to show up in our data. This is purely the figures that I've shown you early on in those orange graphs is employment. So if they're employed, they count. If they're not employed, they don't. So just if you're trying to digest the numbers, and I think all of this information will be shared after the presentation as well. So if you're trying to make sense of it, bear those points in mind. So just to summarise those points, we've seen a slow slide in employment at this point, and with the proviso so far. So August will be very interesting to rerun these numbers. Redundancy claims are at moderate levels, but as I showed you in that chart, they're really starting to pick up, as are those hardship claims. So we've had few so far, but I think this is the week and probably next week as well that they'll start flooding in. So again, it'll be good to revisit this in another couple of weeks' time to demonstrate what's gone on. Member inquiries are still at moderate levels, so I guess that indicates the level of anxiety or reduced anxiety, and hopefully most people are using websites to gain the information that they need, and they're hopefully already at this point, having looked at our website and NECAs and probably ETUs if it's relevant to them, they've got the information they need, so in case a decision's made about a stand down or a redundancy, that they know where they stand. Something I haven't mentioned just yet, but it is quite evident in our data, employer contributions are fairly consistent, and so far, thankfully for everybody, that we've got very little evidence of rising insolvencies. Now, I'll just finish up with a couple of slides just to look at what Protect can do for employers, and perhaps just some other pointers and issues for you to consider. So whether you're making your employees redundant is purely the decision of the employer themselves. It's not something that we would normally get involved in, but I'll touch on some points where we can assist once the decision's made. So bearing that in mind, I think it is obviously important that you understand that what options that you have. Hopefully people have already done that planning, really got a thorough understanding of whether people can take leave, annual leave, long service leave, accrued RDOs, etc., to tie them through. Looking at stand down as an option, and also making sure you've got your head around JobKeeper, particularly now that it's the rules have changed and the whole thing's been extended, which is a good thing. Make sure that you've got a solid handle on your employment agreements, and in particular a stand down clause, making sure you've got your head around that and understanding what the implications are. And employee consultation, so something that perhaps while we're all under a bit of pressure, it's an easy thing to overlook, but often there are clauses in your EBA that require some consultation. For those of you on this call, I'd also emphasise that you're probably, most of you are NECA members. NECA is there for industrial relations advice. So get your money's worth out of your membership and use NECA for that advice. And I've also mentioned our website, protect.net.au. We've got specific pages for employers on there, as well as some information sheets that you can print off that cover a lot of the material that I've spoken about today. So if you haven't already, get on and get a copy of those. Now, once an employer makes a redundancy decision, makes a decision to make their employees redundant, it's worthwhile getting in touch with us for a range of reasons. Now, we've got a field team who are able to visit, or they used to be able to visit people. It's now more virtual visits. And we've also got a person whose responsibility is employer relations. So we do have someone whose job it is to speak to employers and to help them through the situation. And all our member services staff on that number are also capable of explaining what to do in the event of a redundancy and how to make it as smooth as possible for employers and for your workforce that are being made redundant or being stood down. It is important and helpful to inform us early that perhaps you're going to let go of 10 people, 15 people, 20 people. They're being redundant or stood down. That helps us get ourselves organised and also helps with the administration process and making it as smooth as possible for the employers. Now, Protect counselling, I think, is important, probably underutilised at the moment. What is important for you to realise is that if you're a Protect employer contributing to Protect, this counselling service comes free with what we do. It's confidential, it's independent of us, so it's being run by a third party, it's not coming through Protect staff. But I want to emphasise that it's for everybody who is employed in your business. So it's the managers, it's also their families, okay? So that service is available to everybody employed by you. So whether they're on the tools, whether they're in the finance department, etc., it's a service that's available. And also, we've been in a difficult time and it's about to get tougher with stage 4. So if you're having any issues with ongoing contributions, either your severance or your income protection, get in touch with us and we can work through things such as payment plans as well. I'll just finish up with a page on some messages to your employees. So some of you may be involved in payroll or HR or industrial relations. And you're going to have employees sort of quizzing you about certain things. So first thing is that there shouldn't be any of your employees covered by Protect who are feeling anxious because they don't know what their severance balance is. So the website and an app, they're obviously open 24/7. People can go on and check the amount of money that they would get paid out in the event that they're made redundant. So make sure that they do that, because you don't want your staff sitting there feeling anxious, not knowing what they're going to get in the event of a redundancy. If it does happen, again, claiming online or via the app is much more efficient. Another message for your employees is that if you are a Protect member and been contributing to Protect, the money's already been put aside. So if there's any concern amongst your workforce about your business being in financial difficulties, the fact is that the redundancy money, if you've already paid it to Protect, it's sitting there, and the financial position of the business is not necessarily relevant to the redundancy payments. So that may put your employees at ease if those rumours are going around. Counselling I've mentioned, being available for everybody. And hardship payments, I've touched on these before. It is an option if you're considering standing workers down without pay. They get 2 lots of $2,000 payments spaced 5 weeks apart. And those payments, by arrangement with the tax office, have to be taxed. But employers should be aware that that money comes out of their severance account. In the event that they're made redundant later on, there'll be 2 lots of $2,000 less available to them. So they need to be fully aware of the implications. Income protection insurance finally covers workers for illness, and that includes COVID-19, but there's a 2-week waiting period. So if somebody becomes sick and is unable to work because of that illness, then insurance, income protection insurance through Protect does cover that. So that's another option for your employees. And then finally, the field team visits and virtual visits can be booked by that number. So that's the entirety of the presentation. So hopefully you were able to get some useful industry information out of that. We'd just like to finish off with a poll question. And Amy's just opened that for you. So the question is, to manage stage 4 restrictions, what do you expect your business will do, or maybe they've already done it? A, require workers to take leave. B, stand workers down without pay. C, make the workers redundant. Or D, continue as normal. And I think you can pick multiple options, pick several of those options if you think several of them are going to occur. So I'll give you a few seconds to okay, how are we going with that, Amy? Have we got a result?
Yeah, so I'll just give you guys just about 5 more seconds to get in on the poll, and then we'll share the results. Okay, so I'm going to close it now. And here are the results. Okay, so thanks, Michael. I found the content very useful, and I hope that all of our listeners did too. If you have any questions or comments regarding today's topic, please type in the question in the chat box or raise your hand now. While you're doing that, I'm just going to put up some silent poll questions so that all of our listeners can answer those ones. Okay, so I might read out some of these questions that we've got here. So our first one here would be for Michael. Why do you think the electrical industry employment held up more strongly than the rest of construction?
Thanks, Naomi. Look, I think the electrical industry is a highly skilled part of the workforce, and perhaps it's one factor might be that compared to the rest of construction, that perhaps some of the unskilled workers, labourers, etc., maybe they're the first to be made redundant, less so the skilled workforce. I think one of the things using, just trying to rely on our data, and we saw that middle group of employers, the mid-range that employing 6 to 50 workers, had very little movement in their workforce between February and July. I think that's telling us that the small to medium employers are more inclined to hold on to their good workers, hold on to their good employees. I guess if they're holding on to them, that they're also probably more likely to have accrued more leave over that time. And if they've got more leave, that gives the employer just another avenue to deal with the situation where perhaps they can ask those workers to take leave rather than making them redundant to try to get through. So perhaps there's some of the factors that meaning that the electrical industry is just holding up a little bit better. The fact that there's probably also a lot of employment, or there was, with the larger infrastructure projects as well. So they're probably some of the factors for that, Amy.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a question here for Natalie. Given we're in the construction industry, can office staff work from the office?
Thanks, Amy. So there was a bit of confusion around this point when the stage 4 restrictions were initially announced. So NECA, along with the broader construction industry working group, sort of sought urgent clarity around this particular point. So while our industry it's restricted currently, but open to work in some capacity, the messaging is quite clear currently that all office and admin workers should now be working remotely. So that is a requirement. There may be rare cases in which a business cannot actually operate if these functions can't work remotely, don't have that ability, in which case there's been some clarity around the fact that might be an exception to the rule, but you would need to implement a COVID safety plan within the office. You'd need to have a really strong reason that the employees cannot work from home, and they would also need a working permit as well. So I wouldn't, at this stage, the messaging is if they can work from home, they must work from home. And the construction sector guidelines have actually been updated, I think, very recently and published on the Business Gov website under, just construction sector guidance. And we'll be releasing some further information on that in the coming days as well. So keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions on the safety side as well, you can also get in touch with our safety team.
Thanks, Natalie. We are running over time, so I'm just going to read out one more question. So this one's for Saras. Where do I find information on staff and apprentice redundancy processes and requirements?
Okay, so as Michael mentioned, there's some information in Protect for the employer. I think that was on the second or third last slide, and it's just pretty much information on, how you access the Protect Fund when it comes to redundancy and all of that. But in terms of the IR aspect of it, so if you're thinking about your options when it comes to your business at the moment, we have put out a guide for NECA members, and it's on our website under the COVID resources, or alternatively, if you contact us, the Workplace Relations team, we can send it to you. And the guide is quite comprehensive. It contains things like how do you do a reduction of hours, the consultation process for redundancies, how do you do a stand down, and it also has template letters at the end that you can use and customize to your business. And what we can do here in the Workplace Relations team is help you review those letters before you send it out to make sure that you're complying with any consultation process that's in your enterprise agreement. Sometimes you have it in your policy, otherwise it'll be in the award that your employees are covered by. So that's definitely one thing you should do. If you're thinking of starting the process, get in touch with us first, because we can tell you where your consultation requirements come from.
Thanks, Saras. Some great questions that we've been able to get through this morning. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I hope the answers provided some clarity on COVID-19 impact on employment and redundancies. If you didn't get the opportunity to ask your question online, please email us at workplace.relations@neca.asn.au. We will respond to any unanswered chat questions individually after the webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available on the NECA Vic website if you want to rewatch and share with your team. You can also see on the website a full schedule of upcoming webinars. I do encourage you to register even if you can't attend, as we will share the recording with you. Thanks again, Michael, Natalie and Saras. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.